The Trump-era tariffs marked a dramatic shift in American trade policy, signaling a new era of economic confrontation. For decades, the U.S. had championed free trade, but this move upended long-standing global agreements and sent shockwaves through international markets. The administration targeted China and even U.S. allies with sweeping new taxes on imports, aiming to address what it saw as unfair trade practices and massive trade deficits. Suddenly, billions of dollars worth of goods, from electronics to raw materials, were subject to new tariffs. Former President Trump argued these tariffs would protect American industries and jobs, especially in manufacturing, steel, and aluminum. He promised that these measures would revive struggling sectors and restore American pride in its industrial base. The administration hoped higher import costs would push Americans to buy domestic products, spurring economic growth and reducing reliance on foreign goods. Supporters believed this would create a ripple effect, boosting local businesses and communities. But the tariffs sparked a global trade war. China retaliated with its own tariffs, hitting key U.S. exports like soybeans and cars. Other countries soon followed, escalating tensions and creating a tit-for-tat cycle that threatened global economic stability. Businesses worldwide faced uncertainty as supply chains were disrupted and costs soared. Companies scrambled to find new suppliers, reroute shipments, and adapt to a rapidly changing landscape. American companies reliant on imported materials saw expenses rise, often passing those costs to consumers. Small businesses, in particular, struggled to absorb the sudden increases, putting pressure on their bottom lines. Everyday items, from electronics to furniture, became more expensive, subtly raising the cost of living for millions of Americans. Families noticed higher prices at the checkout, even for basic household goods. While some U.S. producers benefited, many others struggled with higher prices and lost markets. Farmers, manufacturers, and retailers all felt the impact, with some forced to close their doors while others saw a brief surge in demand. The tariffs ignited fierce debate. Were they protecting American interests or hurting the economy? Politicians, economists, and everyday citizens found themselves divided, with passionate arguments on both sides. This controversy set the stage for a legal battle that would reach the Supreme Court, challenging the limits of presidential authority over trade, and raising questions about the future of American economic policy. The world watched as America's trade war became a test of presidential power and economic policy, with global markets reacting to every new development. The outcome would shape not just the U.S., but the entire world economy for years to come. Legal challenges to the tariffs began almost immediately, as importers and industry groups argued the president had overstepped his authority. Lawsuits claimed the tariffs were an unconstitutional tax, a power reserved for Congress. Courts had long deferred to the executive on trade and national security, making the challengers' path difficult. As cases wound through appeals, the core question sharpened: can a president unilaterally impose broad economic measures without Congress? By the time the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case in 2025, the tariffs had already reshaped the economy and global trade. The stakes were enormous, not just for businesses, but for the balance of power between the White House and Congress. The court's decision would define the limits of presidential authority in trade for years to come. The nation braced for a ruling that could reset the rules of American governance. At the heart of this landmark Supreme Court case was a deceptively simple, yet deeply consequential question, one that would test the very boundaries of presidential power and congressional authority. Were the tariffs imposed by the president a legitimate tool of trade policy, designed to protect American industries and respond to global economic threats? Or were they, in reality, an illegal tax, one that bypassed the constitutional requirement that only Congress can levy taxes on the American people? The challengers, a coalition of businesses and legal experts, argued that these tariffs were so sweeping and generated so much revenue that they essentially operated as a tax. According to the Constitution, only Congress has the authority to impose taxes, and the president's actions, they claimed, overstepped that boundary. They highlighted the billions of dollars collected from these tariffs, all funneled directly into the U.S. Treasury's general fund, rather than being earmarked for any specific trade or national security program. This, they said, was clear evidence that the tariffs were functioning as a tax in disguise. The government, however, pushed back forcefully. They argued that tariffs have always been a vital instrument of foreign policy and national security, powers that, historically, have been entrusted to the president, especially in times of international tension or economic uncertainty. Citing statutes like the Trade Expansion Act, government lawyers insisted that Congress had already delegated the authority to the president to impose tariffs when national security was at stake, making these actions both legal and necessary. Ultimately, the case became a dramatic showdown over the separation of powers, a fundamental question of who should control the nation's economic destiny. Should the president have sweeping authority to act unilaterally, or must Congress retain the final say over taxes and trade? The Supreme Court's answer would not only resolve this immediate dispute, but also set a precedent with far-reaching consequences for the future of American trade, the balance of power in government, and the everyday lives of businesses and consumers across the country. In a landmark decision, the Supreme Court struck down the Trump-era tariffs, ruling the president had exceeded his authority. The court found the tariffs were, in effect, a tax, something only Congress can impose. This ruling reasserted Congress's control over fiscal matters and set a new precedent, limiting unilateral executive action on trade. The decision marked a turning point, signaling that the president's power in economic policy is not absolute. For Congress, it was both a victory and a challenge to reclaim its constitutional role in trade and taxation. The ruling is expected to spur new legislation clarifying presidential authority under trade laws. The balance of power between the branches of government was fundamentally recalibrated. The Supreme Court's decision sent shockwaves through the global economy, upending years of adaptation to the tariffs. Foreign exporters, especially in China and Europe, suddenly found their goods more competitive in the U.S. market. American importers and retailers welcomed lower costs. But domestic industries like steel and aluminum braced for renewed foreign competition. The abrupt change forced companies to reconsider supply chains they'd painstakingly shifted to avoid tariffs. Some faced tough choices: return to old suppliers or stick with new, costlier arrangements. The ruling exposed the deep interconnections of the global economy and the far-reaching impact of protectionist policies. Winners included foreign producers and U.S. importers. Losers were some domestic manufacturers. Multinational companies and consumers found themselves navigating a new, uncertain landscape. The decision didn't just reverse policy. It triggered a complex, worldwide economic adjustment. The world economy entered a new phase, shaped by the court's historic ruling. For American consumers, the most immediate impact was the promise of lower prices on countless goods. Suddenly, everyday shopping trips felt different. Shoppers noticed that their dollars stretched further, and the weekly grocery bill shrank. The change was subtle at first, but soon became impossible to ignore. Tariffs had quietly raised costs on everything from electronics to furniture. Now, those extra charges vanished. Items that once seemed just out of reach for many families became affordable again, and stores began advertising new deals and discounts. Retailers and importers, facing less expensive imports, could pass savings on to shoppers. Store managers scrambled to update price tags, and customers were quick to take advantage of the new bargains. The retail landscape shifted almost overnight. In the electronics sector, for example, a 25% tariff on smart TVs disappeared overnight, making them more affordable. Families who had postponed big purchases now found themselves upgrading their living rooms, and sales of gadgets and appliances soared. Meanwhile, factories abroad, especially in China, saw a surge in orders as American demand rebounded. Production lines that had slowed or even shut down ramped up again, and shipping containers began flowing steadily from Asian ports to American shores. The decision revitalized global trade links, restoring jobs and production overseas. Workers who had faced layoffs were called back, and the hum of industry returned to many foreign factories. But companies that had moved supply chains to avoid tariffs now faced tough decisions about whether to return to old partners. Some weighed the risks of shifting back, while others hesitated, wary of future policy changes. Thousands of businesses began recalibrating their strategies in response to the new reality. For small business owners, the changes brought both relief and uncertainty, as they tried to predict what would come next. The court's ruling reset the global chessboard, forcing a rapid realignment in both U.S. and international markets. Investors watched nervously as stock prices fluctuated and trade routes shifted, signaling a new era in global commerce. The effects rippled from supermarket aisles to distant factory floors, touching lives and livelihoods in ways both immediate and profound. The Supreme Court's decision split the nation along familiar partisan lines. Supporters hailed it as a win for consumers and free trade, celebrating lower prices and restored global ties. Critics saw it as a blow to American workers and a retreat from protecting domestic industries. In industrial communities, anger simmered over lost jobs and perceived judicial overreach. Polls revealed deep public cynicism about the court's motives and legitimacy. The ruling became more than an economic issue. It was a flashpoint in America's ongoing debate over identity, fairness, and the limits of presidential power. The tariff decision was just the beginning of a Supreme Court term defined by battles over presidential power. The court faced cases on everything from the independence of federal agencies to voting rights and campaign finance. A key case questioned whether presidents could fire heads of independent agencies at will, threatening decades of precedent. Another challenged congressional maps and the strength of the Voting Rights Act, with major implications for minority representation. The court's rulings this term would reshape American law, politics, and society. The tariff case was a clear statement on the limits of executive authority. As the court continued to rule on these critical issues, its own legitimacy and role in a divided nation were under the microscope.